All right. So, welcome back. Today we will start with lecture 4 of module 2. In module 2 we are looking at language variation from a speaker's perspective, how language variation can happen due to the contribution of the speakers themselves, like a speech community, a group, an ethnic group, a social group, and various other kinds. So, we have already looked at some of those parameters before in the previous lecture. Today, we will look at two more parameters. One of them is ethnicity and the other is social network. Both of these are important parameters. However, ethnicity has been studied a lot. So, we will start with ethnicity. Now, ethnicity and language studies, comparing these two and looking at the interaction between these two, these studies go back a long time. And the reason is that ethnic identity is a very important identity of any social group of humans. So, any group. So, typically we tend to belong to one group or the other. Now, that grouping can be, for example, on the basis of some individual choices, or let us say sometimes we are part of a work group, a professional group or a hobby group or something of that sort. For example, you can have a mountaineering club. So, we are part of the mountaineering group of a particular city, or a book reading club. This kind of groupings are quite common. So, this is one kind of a group. This is fine, this is one type, and it is based on individual choices, individual preferences or individual lifestyle, hobby or whatever. This is one. But we are at the same time, we are also part of another larger identity, a larger group, which is called the ethnic group. Now, while the personal choice based groups are based on your preferences, it is a voluntary membership. Being part of an ethnic group is not so. It is where you are born. You are part of an ethnic community, ethnic group. So, this is not this is an involuntary kind of a membership. So, this is something that is integral part of us. So, if we are part of the Indian ethnic group because we are born as an Indian, that kind of a thing, right? We do not choose to be an Indian. Right. So, that is a kind of a membership that is integral to us, and that is why ethnic identities are one of the most important and striking identity markers. Now, this often goes hand in hand with our language. That is why language and ethnicity is a relationship that has been studied for quite a long time. Now, this is an idea, this is a domain that is not a simple straightforward linear kind of a relationship. It is a complex one, but because in this course we are trying to look at the topics in brief. So, we will also have to restrict ourselves to certain kinds of situations, certain kinds of background, socio-cultural background, where we will look at the ethnic language ethnicity connection. So, that is what we mean by where do we when and where do we see this most. So, here I quote, when a group adopts willingly or perforce the dominant language of the society, an important symbol of their distinct identity, that is language, often disappears. So, basically we are looking at a group which is part of a larger group where they are not the majority. So, in a majority society, another group which has a minority status, and often they have to speak the language of the majority, they tend to lose their own language over a period of time. May not happen overnight, but it often does. In that case, if you lose your identity, if you lose your language, you lose your identity. Now, while they are speaking their L2, that marker of ethnicity, that marker of identity somehow shows through their language use. So, that is where we will be focusing our attention primarily. So, this means the markers of ethnicity is most marked in the second language or eventual first language. What do we mean by eventual first language? For example, many Hispanics, for example, who are living in the US, many Indian, many Chinese who are living in US, they might eventually after a period of time adopt English as their first language, and before that English is their second language. So, when they are speaking in English, that English is something that carries the mark of their ethnic identity. That is what we mean by this. Okay. So, examples often include Indians, Hispanics as I just mentioned, African Americans in US, then in Britain you have Scots, Irish and Welsh people, Aboriginal people in Australia, the original people of Australia, the Maoris in New Zealand and so on and so forth. All of these cases you see the group that have been mentioned are not the majority and they have to speak the majority language, which is English in all of these cases. So, the use of distinctive linguistic features by these and many other groups, that is what helps signal the identity, that their ethnic identity. They signal as well as they construct the ethnic identity. So, even though what this means is that even though Indians, Hispanics, African Americans are all of them are minority groups, they each of them have their own marker, linguistic marker of their identity even when they are speaking in English, that is the idea. So, this is true for even those whose phenotype is not starkly distinct from the majority. What this means is that in US is primarily a country of migrants. So, different waves of people who have traveled to US and settled down. So, there was a group of people who came from Europe, various European countries, they came to US and settled down there. So, that is one group of migrants who are non-natives. Now, these people and eventually whatever we know as American people, these people do not look very distinct from them, whereas the Hispanics, the Chinese, the Indians, we look different. So, that is what phenotype means. Of course, we look different, we have our different phenotypical markers, identities, and we also have our linguistic identity. But even people, for example, Italians or others like Jews, they also are part of different at different times point of time they have all migrated to US. Even their language have distinct markers of their ethnic identity. So, that is what it means that every community, no matter whether you look like the majority or not, may have eventually they may have their ethnic identity signaled by in their language. Now, before we dive into the linguistic markers of ethnicity of whichever kind, we have some examples, but before that let us see what we even mean by ethnicity. Some definitional discussion is in order. So, here are some of the definitions given by various well known scholars. So, for example, the one given by Bell in 2014 kind of recent, a group that shares sociological characteristics, meaning sense of place and ancestry, a common history, religion, cultural practices, ways of communicating and often a language. So, this is a group of people who have all of these markers as their, they share all of these features, that is what ethnicity means. So, most of the time all of these, but at least majority of these. Slightly older definition by Fishman in 1998, he calls it the macro group belongingness or identificational dimension of culture, whether that of individuals or of aggregates per se, narrower than culture and more perspectival than culture. That is how Fishman puts it, that is how he defines it. Now, this is a very kind of a broad definition. So, we need to unpack it a little bit more, where we will take help from Wolfram 2007. Here he talks about the ethnic groups that involve a few parameters and he breaks it down into 6 parameters. So, we have one, origins that precede or are external to the state. So, it is not a nation state sort of an identity, it typically precedes the state or at least is external. Group membership, that is involuntary, as we said in the very beginning, that you cannot choose to be part of an ethnic group, it is what you are. Ancestral tradition rooted in shared sense of peoplehood. This is understandable, who you are as a people, who you are as a community, that kind of a sense of belongingness should be there. Then distinctive value orientation and behavioral patterns. So, these are cultural patterns typically. So, when you say an Indian ethos, you understand what it means. So, there is a very different kind of value system, very different kind of orientations towards things, everything around you, similarly the behavioral patterns. So, all of it will be shared by all the members of an ethnic group. This is what it means. Influence of the group on the lives of its members. And last, group membership influenced by how members define themselves and how they are defined by others. But it is very clear cut, and he has tried to unpack, even though all 6 of these parameters have a lot of give and take between them, but this is what this makes the entire idea very clear. Let us go a little bit back in history as to where the term ethnicity comes from. Like many other things, this also goes back to the Greeks. Now, this is from the Liddell and Scott's Greek English lexicon, where they have traced the history of this the word. Starts with the word ethnicity came much later. It starts with the original, the oldest version they have mentioned is ethnos. Now, in the oldest version, this meant a number of people living together, body of men, particular tribes of animals and flocks. So, any kind of a collective. Any kind of collective, it is not only humans, but even other animals and flocks of birds or whatever. So, that is what basically a collective of people or other beings. After Homer, the meaning changed to nation and people. Later, even later it meant foreign, barbarous nation, non-Athenians. So, Athenians considered non-Athenians as ethnos. And then in biblical Greek, the meaning changed again. Now, here in biblical Greek, this means non-Jews, Gentiles, class of men, caste, tribe and so on. So, you see this is not a very the today what we mean by ethnic group or ethnicity has also gone through a lot of changes in the parent language, that is Greek, from where it came. Once ethnic or equivalent established itself in English, this is the first citation goes back all the way to 1473 of the term ethnic. This regularly has the meaning of heathen and foreign, right. So, anything that is non-Christian. So, Oxford English Dictionary cites a second set of meanings from the 19th century, tracing to 19th century, leaving the heathen out. Heathen was there for a long time, but then this has been taken out later. So, now we have this definition ethnic, meaning pertaining to race, common racial or cultural character. And then Oxford Dictionary also uses the term in its combination with minority groups. So, they call ethnic minority groups, and as a noun meaning one who is not a Christian or Jew. So, predominantly today since some time till today in the western context, it is not the same context in India or other eastern nations. In the western context, ethnic means something other than the majority. Majority here means either Christians or Jews. Now, comes our ethnicity and language relationship. Now, in many cultures, in fact, in most cultures, language is an important characteristic of the ethnic group membership, because to become part of our part of an ethnic group, you have to also speak that language, the language that identifies with the ethnic group. So, there are two ways we look at it. There are as I said in the beginning, this is a very complex sort of an interaction where you can have multiple layers. So, here we are talking about only two types of that. For example, different languages distinguish ethnic groups. So, each group one language. So, one group one language, another group another language, like this. One good example will be in multilingual Africa, you have for example, Accra suburb with 80 plus mother tongues, typically will be referring to 80 plus groups, ethnic groups. So, each group is identified with a different language. Similarly, in Canada, everybody knows this, English and French divide we have. So, English speaking group, ethnic group, and French speaking French ethnic group, and so on. That is one type, one ethnic group, one language. But here what we are primarily focusing on is the second kind, where different varieties of the same language signal different ethnic identity. So, English is a good example here, because English due to colonialism, English is spoken in multiple countries in the world. Now, many of these people have also migrated to the English speaking nations, as a result of which each of these communities have made some distinct contributions to the English language itself, which eventually have now become markers of their ethnic identity, and this is what we will be focusing more on. So, there are multiple reasons for linguistic markers of ethnicity. Why do we even have that in the first place? So, first and foremost, this is what Holmes mentions. So, first the group may have a different L1, and that is why while speaking in the more dominant language, which is the L2, the features of that language carries over. This is something very common. Your L1 has a direct impact on the way you speak your L2. So, cross linguistic influence, that is one, because it may or may not have started with those markers may not be voluntary to start with. Initially probably it was simply a transfer of the L1 features on the L2 features, and later it is about the usage of the language, where it probably is used as a signal of the ethnic identity. Now, for example, Indian English or Maori English. So, Indian English, you even if you do not see the person, once you hear an Indian speaking in English, it is very easily identifiable, because of the features of our mother tongue, features of Indian languages getting transferred into our English. Similarly, for Maori English. Similarly, in Singapore, Chinese Singaporeans use of la, for example, is a tag word that is carried from their ethnic language. So, how do we what we see on the surface is that when we speak in English, it has certain distinct markers, which now we call the markers of our ethnic identity. But how did it even come about? It is not that some markers are created out of thin air. Those markers come from our first language. So, that is the idea we are getting at here. So, the marker is evident in both sound system, lexicon and grammar. The marker that we are talking about, of course, we have mentioned here only a couple of examples, but they can be in the lexicon, meaning there are some distinct words from your mother tongue that is used in your English. Even when you are speaking in English, those words from your L1 might be used as it is in the L2. That is how lexicon can be transferred. Similarly, sound system is one of the most distinct types of ethnic markers, which we will see soon, and grammar also. So, these are the three domains where we see these markers of ethnic identity. Now, also sometimes it is a voluntary kind of an usage, or let us say choice, because by using those markers, we want to signal our ethnic identity. We want to make it evident that we are identifying with our group, in group, rather than trying to merge in with the majority group. That is also possible. So, this is done to distinguish themselves from the majority group. So, there are two sides to this story. One is your mother tongue will, your L1 features will tend to cross over, or let us say to influence your L2, and this is almost involuntary, it happens over a long period of time. However, in some cases, even when the speakers have a choice, they might choose to keep those markers in. Now, let us look at some examples. One of the most studied language perhaps is, this is how it is abbreviated, African American Vernacular English, that has been studied by many scholars in fact. So, there are many examples out there. Now, the original language of them disappeared of course long time ago, but their speech is still distinct. How they started and how they speak today, there have been some changes. So, you can look at the old literature of those times when slavery was still practiced, or even after that it took some time for the language change to happen, but in those days the language was very different. So, there is an example here. Now, I have added a disclaimer here. There are some debates about the African American English, whether it should be considered an ethnic variety or should it be considered a regional variety. The reason being, there has been some discussion on this in some quarters, that the language that the plantation workers learned, the kind of English they spoke, is not something they invented. This is the English that their masters spoke, and those are the rednecks. So, the rather this is traced back to the white rednecks who lived predominantly there. So, they simply followed the white man's language, and those rednecks apparently their history goes back to somewhere in the north of Scotland. So, this was a regional variety. Eventually, it came to be identified with the African American vernacular English. Whatever may be the case, but today we identify this variety of English as an ethnic variety, typically identifiable with the African Americans. Some of the most important features of this language. So, this is one example. So, there will be the absence of the copula verb. So, they what does it mean? They omit the variants of the be verb. So, I am, you are, that variant of the be verb is often absent. Nothing be wrong with the way I be talking. So, here what they do is they will keep the be as it is, rather than making it in English language be does not remain just as be, it becomes either is, am, are, like that. That is not done. So, they avoid they omit the variants, but keep the be as it is. And for example, she very nice, sometimes she be very nice is also not there, she very nice, and when the be is used, it is used with as it is. So, children do be messing around a lot. Here it means that something that happens all the time. So, by to signal recurring or repeated events, that is when be is used, and just as be, nothing, no variant of it. Simplification of consonant clusters also are very common. For example, last time the T is missing here, this is last time. So, the consonant cluster of S and T, sa and ta sound, it is simplified into last time. And of course, the most telltale sign is the double negative, that is quite well known. Similarly, we have British Black English. British Black English has more varieties within themselves also, but we are not getting into that complexity. So, they have one of the most studied is called the Patois or the British Jamaican Creole, which is which has been studied a lot, and these are some of those features of the British Jamaican Creole. So, the use of features associated with Patois variety of English signals a person's ethnicity as British Black. Now, British Black English is not similar to the African American English, they are distinct. Okay. And so, this is in this case it is a Creole. Creole typically go back to Pidgin. So, Pidgin becomes a Creole, and eventually if the situation allows, it can go through the decreolization process and approximate the lexifier source language. So, British Black English is falls in that category. Okay. And but it is different from the standard English. It has distinct lexical items, pronunciation is different, stress and intonation patterns are different, plural forms lack the plural marker s on the end, and often tenses are not marked with suffixes. These are some of the most important markers of the British Black English. Now, this is not only about the structure of the patois, but the way it is used, that is more important. Many scholars have pointed out that it is not that they do not know the standard variety, they do, and they can use the standard variety as well as the white British speakers, but they do not do. They use these varieties with a specific purpose. Sometimes they use it, of course, they use it with fellow patois, but they also use it with the standard British speakers. Now, this is as a result, this is often used as a more of an in group variety. It is an identity marker of solidarity or some sort. Okay. So, this is as a marker of identity rather than their inability to speak the standard variety. Use of standard variety by members of the group during in group conversation might even be seen as snobby. So, two members of the same Patois group are talking to each other, and there if they use the standard variety, even if they know the standard variety, they are not supposed to use it, because then you will be seen as you are trying to appear snobby. So, that is how where we draw the line, in terms of how you use the language or the markers of your language as an identity marker, and differentiate yourself from the the in group out group differentiation is also marked with that. Another interesting case is the Maori English. So, all the English speaking countries and where how the non English speakers, how they speak and how it actually is considered a marker of their identity is what we are looking at. So, we looked at the US English, the African American English, then we looked at the Black British English, now we are in New Zealand. So, in New Zealand we have the Maoris, the original inhabitants, the aboriginal group. The mention of the word Maori English goes back to the 1960s and 70s. Maori, many of you might be already aware of, is a textbook study of how a language and culture and the community pride can be brought back from extinction. Maoris were sidelined once English became dominant, and eventually there was some sort of a revolution where Maori language was brought back. And now you see they use it, their cultural practices are they practice all their cultural events and their activities. The haka dance, for example, is quite popular. It is practiced for many sports events and so on. So, it is now mainstream. It was not always the case. They had to fight for it. Anyway, so the mention of Maori English goes back to the 60s and 70s, and this was at that time it was used as a disparaging tone, because the Maori children in the Pakeha. So, the Pakehas are the white settlers in New Zealand, the Europeans and other places. So, the white people who settled in New Zealand are called Pakeha. So, the Pakeha schools had Maori children as well. So, children were not doing very well, and that is when their English was called Maori English. And eventually Richard's work was a landmark work in 1970s, where he counted the claim that they are poor or they are they are not able to speak the English properly. Rather, he said this is a distinct variety of English. That is how Maori English came to be considered as a distinct variety rather than a poorer form of the English spoken in New Zealand. So, this was the status that was accorded starting with Richard's work in 70s. In fact, his work was quite detailed, and he in those days he proposed four varieties of New Zealand English: Maori English 1, Maori English 2 and Pakeha English 1, Pakeha English 2. Now, Pakeha we are not going there, but Maori English 1 was the English of the educated middle class Maori New Zealanders. This is a class divide that he brought to the fore. And Maori English 2 was the larger group of Maoris from lower socio-economic background. So, this is where the majority of Maori speakers belong to. There were very few in the upper classes. So, the middle class, educated and all that, that group was small. The bigger group was the second group. Now, even though Maori English is used predominantly within the Maori context, but it is not restricted to the Maori context. It is very common to find this language being used by the Pakehas as well, but in specific context. For example, Pakehas who have a strong social bond with the Maoris. In New Zealand, unlike other places, the Maoris and the Pakehas share a much better social contact compared to many other places. So, there is a lot of, it is possible for Pakehas to have good social connection with the Maoris and vice versa. Even in 70s, there was some mention of interaction, and now of course, things are much better. Now, there is a little bit of disagreement and debate as to whether Maori English can be considered a variety, even though Richard's work go back all the way to 70s, but even as late as 2013 work and some work after that also, they do not really say that Maori English is actually a very distinct variety. The primary reason being that exactly the same as I was just talking about, that the Pakehas also often use some of the features of the Maori English. It is probably because of a lot of give and take between them. Nonetheless, the textbooks still point out some features of the Maori English which appear to be distinct. So, first and foremost, of course, they use their Maori words in English conversation. So, even in a otherwise English conversation, they might start their conversation with the kia ora, that is the typical way the Maoris greet each other. So, that might be there. So, this is very common. And then of course, you have the distinct nature of the sound system. So, this is how they often tend to merge sounds with. So, the tha with the ta and the za with sa, and basically because they do not have dental, I think Maori does not have a dental this sound, the sound. So, they tend to merge, but it is a little difficult to pinpoint it only as a Maori, as I said. It is also found in some cases. And then the pragmatic tag a, this is also a distinct, apparently a distinct marker of Maori English. So, when we talk about Maori English as a specific variety, these are the ones. Also, Maori women are found to delete the auxiliary have and also use double negative. Double negative is also common with the African American vernacular English, the Ave variety. So, as I just said, so the other studies have shown that many of these features are also used by Pakehas, mainly because of the social, the kind of social structure that they have in New Zealand. Now, we move on to the New Englishes. New Englishes refer to the English spoken by the colonies, the erstwhile colonies of the English of the British Empire. So, there you have, because of long term colonial domination, many of these countries, for example, Fiji, Hong Kong. So, we have Fiji English, Hong Kong English, Singapore English, of course, Indian English and English in the Philippines. So, all of these, because they were colonies, English was imposed as the official language, and it is still there. Right now I am speaking in English. So, this language also has been in many scholars have called it a recolonization. So, we have taken English, we were given English, we took it and started to make it our own. This has also resulted in various varieties of English. So, you have like the ones that I have noted here, Hong Kong English, Fiji, and so on and so forth. Because in many of these countries, English is not anymore considered a foreign language, and there is also not a part of the British English. Now, of course, there is a lot of you can see the younger generation tries to approximate to American English, but even then it is now a given fact that all these places have developed their own version of English. So, that comes under a new term called New Englishes. Now, there is a sharp distinction between under the New Englishes. So, the many scholars have made a distinction between the settlement colony versus the exploitation colony. So, right until now we are talking about other places like US and New Zealand, these are settlement colonies where they went and lived, but other countries, many other countries are considered exploitation colonies like India, Kenya and so on. So, here in these cases where English was learnt, adopted and therefore influenced by local language spoken by the local people. So, hence we have a lot of varieties coming out of this kind of scenario as well. And then we have Latino English. Latino English, that is the English spoken in the Latin countries, so the Southern American countries. So, we have various communities, for example, the Puerto Rican and the Latino communities. Latino English have developed because of the varieties of English spoken in a community in those regions. So, there are various non-standard morphosyntactic features. For example, again for some reason multiple negation, double negation is a common feature, except in maybe the Indian English, Fijian, but many other places you see this. It is there in some parts in case of Maori English, it is there in African American English, it is also there in here. And then regularization of the irregular past tense verb. So, ed we have seen this is something that when you are learning English, children typically tend to make a mistake. So, the ed marker as a past tense is also used with the irregular verbs. Children eventually learn to correct themselves, but in this variety this remains. So, she striked me, should have been she struck me. Now, it has here they use striked. Similarly, some features of ave are also used, habitual be and zero copula, like we saw in African American vernacular English. Phonology is also distinctive. Chicago English uses less frequent vowel reduction. Vowel reduction is not there. So, because becomes because, so it is kind of the structure is slightly changed, and monophthongization of diphthongs. Diphthongs can be changed into monophthongs. Chicano English intonation has more glides, lengthen syllable with pitch rise for emphasis. In contrast, American English varieties use stress for emphasis. So, not only the structural changes, but also how they are used and why they are used, that is also different. Indian English, of course, all of us are familiar with it. So, phonological in case of phonology, Indian English has a distinct accent. Most of the time it is influenced by L1. So, certain sounds will not be there, and certain sounds, extra sounds will be added to English language, which English originally did not have. Similarly, retroflex sounds, though this is so common that this is very easily. In fact, one of the most telltale markers of Indian English is the retroflex sound, which English actually does not have. British English or American English, they do not have. Alveolars also occur. Dental plosives replace the fricative. For example, thanks have plosives in the initial position. Vowels lack RP diphthongs, and so on and so forth. Morphology, Indian lexical items are adopted in English. So, you have bandh, lathi, thali, all kinds of Indian words are there in terms of they have changed the way they are used. So, drama means play, clever means intelligent, and so on and so forth. Pluralization of mass nouns. So, furniture is actually in plural in itself, but we tend to make it furnitures, all these kind of things. Syntax, WH questions without inversion, where you are going, this is very common. It should be where are you going, but you can hear it on the street, a lot of people talk like this, where you are going. This is also a common marker of Indian English. So, these were the ethnic markers of language in certain groups. Now, we come to the second type of marker, which is based on social networks. Now, depending on kind of people that you are surrounded with, the kind of networks that you are part of, the kind of groups that you are part of also has its own way of creeping into the language that we use. So, friends, family members, workmates and other social groups, they all are part of what we call social network. People well integrated into a particular social group have a particular linguistic characteristics than the peripheral members. So, if you are a member of a particular group, the in-group out-group again. So, the core members will be speaking in a particular way, the peripheral members may not be using those. This is defined by Milroy. The relationships individuals contract with others, reaching out through social and geographical space, linking many individuals. This is how the social network has been defined by Milroy. In social linguistics, social networks gain in significance starting from Lebov's work on Martha's Vineyard, where we saw that we have discussed Martha's Vineyard before also, where we saw that even in the rural area, depending on the social group you are part of, language can be different. There are markers of each of those groups. It showed that networks of the Chilmark fishermen and the Menemsha Native Americans and how their speech were characterized by frequent use of I and O centralization. So, basically depending on the group that you are part of, you will have a different way of signaling your identity. So, James Milroy and Leslie Milroy's research in Belfast, another landmark study, that marked the systematic study of social networks as the basis of linguistic variation. Milroy's work is very well known landmark study. What they found was individuals are part of networks of personal ties with varying qualities and strengths. Now, they are strong. So, depending on the kind of strength you have on the ties, how strong the ties are, there are two types. So, strong ties and weak ties, this is how they put it. So, strong ties are like family members and friends, weak ties will be co-workers and acquaintances, but all of these have a potential to influence the way you speak, the kind of linguistic markers that we might be using. So, strong ties tend to enforce norms of behavior. Having strong ties with people who use local ways of speaking motivates to use those kind of those ways of speaking. So, for example, in certain kinds of groups may be fond of using certain kinds of language structure. Now, if the tie is very strong, you will not be able to break out of it. So, you will be eventually you will be using all of that. That is what he means. Weak ties allows the possibility of diffusion and change. So, in this case the impact is not that strong. So, those terms, those markers might get diffused over a period of time. Now, based on this there are two parameters that they talked about. One was density, the other is complexity. Within density you have basically how loose or tight the network is. So, he calls it maximally loose and maximally dense network depending on how loose or tight the network is. So, in case of maximally loose, none of the people know each other. Maximally dense, everyone in the networks knows everyone else. And then you have complexity, the number of relationship each person has with another person in the network. So, again maximally simplex and maximally multiplex network. Maximally simplex will be each person would have only one type of relationship like friend, neighbor, co-worker or whatever, only one kind of relationship. Maximally complex can have multiple. So, you can have a friend who is also a co-worker, who is also a neighbor, all kinds of things. So, depending on how complex the interaction, the relationship between the members of that network is, that will also have an impact on the way language. So, these two measurements are used and correlated with how the way way individuals in a particular network speak. So, this is what I have quoted from Walker 2024 study. This is how you can visually show the what it means. So, this is a loose and simplex network, very simple kind of a network, not everybody is not connected with everybody. The most dense and multiplex network. So, there are two parameters, density and complexity, each having two layers again. Now, we have multiple possibilities of connecting. So, this is how this has been created. So, dense and simplex, dense and multiplex, loose and simplex, because loose cannot have multiplex, right, because loose by definition is loose, you do not have a very strong tie. There are many studies in this area, some of them are for example, this is one English spoken by the Puerto Ricans in New York City, and their study, their English was compared with the English spoken by blacks. So, this is a 2001 study. So, they had two groups within the PR is Puerto Rican English, the group in New York. Now, they depending on what kind of connection they had with the African Americans in New York, they tried to see if the language differs. Very interesting study. So, two groups had one was extensive social contact with the black speakers and the second group was no contact. So, one group had extensive contact, other had no contact, and both are PR group. The variable in this case means the linguistic feature that they studied was the realization of the vowel A in try. The word try that has the vowel I, that the use of that variable monophthongal A in certain black English. So, they were trying to see how they perform. Now, the percentage of monophthongs used by black speakers generally on their own is 77%. Typically, PR speakers, that is Puerto Rican speakers, use only 40% of monophthongs. However, those Puerto Rican speakers with black contacts had 70% of usage of the monophthongs. So, this was a study, a very important study showing how social contacts or social groups can influence your use of language. Now, here are two different groups in the same city, but simply because of the contact you see a different kind of language structure. Small changes, but eventually they become cemented. Similar studies have been done on teenagers. Teenagers are a very good case in point, because they tend to signal their separate identity, they tend to have a tendency towards making themselves distinct, and thereby they use a different kind of language. So, one study was done in Hackney, inner city area of London. Now, this area is completely multicultural. This is called multicultural London English, because this is used by the adolescents from various ethnicities, Jamaican, African and Asian. London has a very multicultural ethos. So, you have all kinds of people staying there. So, what they saw was this particular variety, they use distinct vowels, face for face, go for the British pronunciation for face is not the way English Indian English pronounces it. So, it is something like a slight like a diphthong, face. Go is not simple go, it is go. So, there is a slight difference. This particular variety has gotten rid of that, rather they elongate the E vowel. Similarly, go becomes O is slightly lengthened and so on. Similarly, they have different use of lexical items. So, they called blood as for friends, nang means good, buff means attractive and so on and so forth. So, the study they put down the reason for the new variety on immigration and also constructing a separate identity from other groups, which is something that is very common among the young adults and adolescents. In today's time, you can just listen to the teenagers, adolescents and young adults, you can identify who is more addicted to Insta and other such platforms by simply looking at their vocabulary. Vocab is what they use. So, you will know the more the usage of certain kinds of terms, the more they have been spending time there. So, this is various kinds of scenarios which lead to change in the language. They are, it is not like there is a small but interesting point here, which is that the youngsters, because they want to sound distinct, because they want to be distinct, they take to those new terms more readily than anybody else would. So, people of an older generation, even if they are exposed to those terms, chances of them adopting them is very less. So, this also has to work both ways, not just because the trigger is there, but because you are a willing participant. Now, there is another idea called communities of practice. Communities of practice basically is part of social theory of learning in transforming new employees into core members. How, when new employees join an organization, what are the practices through which they can be inducted as core members. So, this is how the COP was originally developed. COP is communities of practice. Now, this is a unit of analysis introduced to sociolinguistics only in the 1992 by Eckert and others. This is also a kind of social network, that is why we are discussing this with social network. Another kind of social network, but it is characterized by mutual engagement and jointly negotiated enterprise and shared repertoire. Mutual engagement because it involves direct personal contact among members, stronger requirement than social network. What does it mean, stronger network, stronger requirement? Because you are tied by some kind of a goal. If it is part of an organization, you have to behave in a particular way. There is some requirements that are beyond your, it is not a very easily loosely connected kind of a network. It is almost to some extent it is enforced sort of a network. So, you have to. So, the speech style, jargon, slang, even slang, in jokes extends beyond the language into social practices, which are also part of COP. So, jointly negotiated enterprise, because the most crucial criterion for COP where members pursue a specific goal, that is one of the most important thing. In case of social networks, there is no goal as such, you are just part of a group, you are just part of a network. Ethnic groups are even are involuntary, but this in this case, in case of COP, there is a shared goal. For example, workplace related studies or workplace related dynamics. So, that is important. So, these are related to ethnographic research that were conducted in high schools, studying how adolescents go through a period of identity formation and peer group coalescence and pressure. In fact, this particular study by Eckert of high school outside Detroit, in which she found 3 groups with different social values and practices. The jocks identifying with school values participated in school activities, the burnouts inactive in school activities identified with urban working class culture, and the in between identify with neither groups. So, this is one example and one interesting study that was carried out. So, this lecture primarily highlights the main contribution of ethnicity and social groups in creating variation within a language. We have been able to give you some examples, but we have added the references, more studies can be looked up. Thank you. This is the end of lecture 4. Thank you.